When it comes to certain religious scriptures and certain religious traditions and mythologies, in the tales and in the stories they tell, certain archetypes seem to be present, or certain archetypes seem to be symbolized in the figures or the characters mentioned within these stories. And one of these archetypes that I've actually thought about is that of the adventurer king. And most notably, this archetype appears in the context of the story of Dhul-Qarnayn. Dhul-Qarnayn is essentially, it's the name, it's the title of a king whose tale is mentioned in the 18th chapter of the Quran. It quite literally translates to the two-horned one. And the Quranic description of him was a pious and just king who had his realm, had his sort of civilizational empire established in the various ends of the earth, meaning he had conquered most of the known world at the time. And so, generally speaking, many Quranic exegetes or those who interpret the Quran have understood this to refer to Alexander the Great, for example. But there are issues with that interpretation. Others have mentioned, for example, Darius or Cyrus. And for example, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the famous Indian modernist Islamic scholar, mentioned that Dhul-Qarnayn was actually Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, which is an interesting interpretation. But nevertheless, Dhul-Qarnayn, this story, whatever his historical identity may truly be, it's interesting to note the archetype that is symbolized by Dhul-Qarnayn, which is this of an adventurer king. Now, of course, this is a quite symbolic meaning. So, for those of you who are religious and may still hold on to, let's say, a literal meaning, or who may believe that these events were literally true, you can still obviously interpret this in terms of the fact that despite it literally occurring, these symbolic meanings can be implied or understood from this still. The symbolic and literal meanings don't have to negate or conflict with one another. And if you're an atheist or an agnostic or a non-religious person, you don't have to take a literal position here. You can understand and benefit from the symbolic meanings here. The point being that whether you're religious or non-religious or atheist or agnostic or theist, you can still benefit here, right? Regardless of whether you view the stories literally or not, you can appreciate the symbolic meanings given here. And in this case, the symbolic meaning here being the archetype of the adventurer king. Now, there's three distinct archetypal characteristics that are embodied within the character of Dhul-Qarnayn. The first of these is the adventurer, the second of these is the warrior, and the third of these is the king. Now, the adventurer aspect here, of course, is the fact that Dhul-Qarnayn undertakes this journey to the edges of his realm, right? He travels to distant lands and he encounters new peoples. And obviously, within the context of his story, he also encounters the warlike peoples of Gog and Magog, who I made a video about in the past. So, this archetype of the adventurer, right? It reinforces this idea, the virtue of human curiosity, or that there's a kind of virtue attached in humanity seeking out what was previously unknown to them. And this is embodied in the story, of course, where Dhul-Qarnayn goes on this journey to lands hitherto unknown to him or to his civilization. He discovers these new lands, he engages with these new people, and he learns more about the world than what he previously knew, and he seeks to engage with it. And there's an interesting lesson here in that some people may have this kind of idealistic isolationist stance towards not engaging with things, right? They may glorify their ignorance, but this is not necessarily correct because, there's a whole world out there to be discovered. That's obviously kind of a cliche, but the reality is that ignorance is not a virtue. Knowledge and experiencing the world as it truly is, for what it really is what is virtuous ultimately. The second archetype here is that of the warrior. Of course, Dhul-Qarnayn, being such a powerful king, having such a vast realm, would naturally have to have this kind of martial prowess. And there's a few lessons here, obviously, that, if one has this kind of martial prowess, this kind of might and power, he should use it for good in the world. He should use it to bring about positive change, to bring about justice. This, of course, reflects the Quranic archetype of the just ruler or of the divine vicegerent, or the idea that man was created to be a representative of God on the earth, and hence he should reflect the divine attributes. And from those divine attributes should be justice and power and mercy, right? And so, through his power and through his dominion on the earth, he should bring about justice and peace for all of its inhabitants, and not just be like, let's say, selfish or greedy. Furthermore, the story of Dhul-Qarnayn, where he does not directly engage with the tribes of Gog and Magog in order to defeat them, but rather he erects a barrier, right, to stop their conquests. It demonstrates that technological prowess will always beat brute sort of might and brute physical force. And hence, a leader or a ruler, if he wants to be successful, should place more emphasis on technological development than simply raising the strongest army possible. But also, alongside that, if one is weak in a certain area, he should not, necessarily take that as a sign of defeat, but rather he should level the playing field by engaging perhaps in unconventional tactics or taking an alternative means or alternative way. Here, of course, Dhul-Qarnayn does not directly confront or try to battle the tribes of Gog and Magog, but rather he simply indirectly halts their advance so that they cannot continue in their conquests, as per the Quranic narrative at least. Then there is the third archetypal characteristic which can be mentioned here, and that is the characteristic of the king, the ruler. Of course, much of what I said about the king is already mentioned within the second point about the warrior. But to summarize and to just reinforce this point further, the king is the one, the true, king, the true leader is the one who can inspire, who can transform, who can bend the fabric of the cosmos within his very image, who can inspire the masses to great feats, and who by his own feats inspires the people around him. The will to power is obviously an interesting concept, but great men and great women throughout history have truly been able to will to power, to inspire change, and to essentially just create a new world in their very image. Combining all of these three characteristics together, you get the idea, the archetype rather, of the adventurer king, right? The adventurer here obviously being its own archetypal characteristic, and the king here can be both within the meaning of the warrior and the king, or the warrior king. And so all three of these archetypal characteristics are combined within the character of Dhul-Qarnayn. And so this adventurer king archetype can also be called the Dhul-Qarnayn archetype, right? The king who with his martial prowess seeks to journey across the various lands, learn about new places, learn about new peoples, right? And to understand the world better, to conquer various lands, and to bring about justice on the earth. Of course, it's important to point out a bit of nuance here in that obviously, a king who conquers a vast amount of land, or a king who seeks to conquer lots of different peoples and subjugate them, in most cases, unfortunately, it's not a very positive thing, right? At times, it's been a very negative thing, and history bears witness to the fact of how kings have unfortunately mistreated their conquered peoples. Yet there have been great figures throughout history who have shown great mercy and great affection for the subjects of their empire, or the subjects within their nations. And the adventurer king archetype, of course, is one which combines both human curiosity and human power, and the combination of power and curiosity gives rise to a really strong force, right? It combines these two essential aspects of human nature into two, let's say, absolutely unstoppable forces which manifest themselves in one figure. This archetype of the adventurer king can be seen throughout history. For example, when it comes to, let's say, people like Alexander the Great, right? I mean, he conquered most of the known world at the time, and countless cultures, countless peoples came within his empire. And Alexander the Great was without a doubt one of the greatest men of history, and this can be seen by the fact that after he passed away, his empire virtually collapsed, and it's almost as if his persona single-handedly kept his empire together. And there are many examples of this throughout history, of course. And, whether or not Dhul-Qarnayn is one of these historical figures, whether or not it's a retelling, a sort of legendary mythical retelling of a historical event, we can still appreciate, at least on a symbolic level, the archetype that is represented here. This Dhul-Qarnayn archetype, this idea of the adventurer king. And throughout history, there have been great figures, great leaders, who have been the very embodiment of this archetype.